Welcome to History Author ShowTime. I'm Dean Karayanis, and in this episode, we'll dig into The Americans, the mid-20-teens FX TV drama starring Kerry Russell and Matthew Rhys as a pair of Soviets spying in the U.S. during the 1980s. This look back into the pop culture past examines the series to see what it gets right and wrong about yesterday, beyond the nitpicking you can read for yourself at places like IMDb. So let's pour ourselves some bourbon, or vodka if you prefer, and pop some popcorn. We're going to hit the stream on Amazon Prime and step through The Guardian of Forever. I was born in 1969, exactly the midpoint of the Cold War, which stretched roughly from 1947 to 1991. So The Americans really took me back to those days of high tension, leaving me to reflect on history I saw unfold around me as I was growing up.
You think Russia's a threat now? Let me tell you about a little thing called the Cold War. They had nukes pointed at us for 20 years. You couldn't even skateboard to a blockbuster without getting nuked.
To get up close and personal insight into The Americans, I reached behind the Iron Curtain to my interview with former KGB agent Jack Barsky about his book, Deep Undercover: My Secret Life and Tangled Allegiances as a KGB Spy in America. Here's what Jack had to say about The Americans and how they portrayed his life in the spy business. Jack, I'm always interested in how people who lived through events react to dramatized depictions on screen. What do shows like The Americans and Hollywood at large get right about your life as a KGB spy? And are there any moments over the years that have made you laugh out loud because they're just so unrealistic?
Oh, yeah. Much of Hollywood is just, to me, is a comedy because it's so unreal that it doesn't make any sense. Much of what is written in literature, novels, while they might be very readable and exciting and wonderful, completely off with regard to reality. The only author who I really think got it right is John le Carré. With regard to realistic treatment, I think The Americans have come as close as possible, particularly when it comes to the psychology of being undercover. And, you know, when Mr. Wiseman says crippling insularity of a spy's life, he caught that very well. So the Americans, the producers, know what they're doing. They really like the psychological aspect of their show, but they also need to entertain. And so 80% entertainment, this is what people like, this is fast-moving, blah, blah, blah. The real life of an undercover agent is like rather boring and mostly feels like watching paint dry. Two things that make me laugh out loud. One of them comes out of The Americans when the undercover people run around with wigs on their heads. Now, every time I see one of the two with a wig, I'm saying, you can't do that. Simply because if you're recognized as having worn a wig once, you're dead. You know, you just can't do it. The other one that makes me laugh out loud is because I know information technology. When in spy movies they show that somebody getting on a computer and typing things in real fast, and then there's these characters flying across, and then somebody says, I got it, we're getting in. This is total nonsense. It doesn't happen like that. Espionage and counterintelligence in the cyberspace is very meticulous and takes a lot of time and is not something you can actually film and get somebody to watch and be entertained by it.
Well, the closest we can come to the real story is Deep Undercover. I just have to say it. This book really does read like that. It's not an insult to it as it may sound sometimes, or condescending to say it reads like a spy novel. For people interested in the real history of what the life was like, this explains that. You can look at something like The Americans and say, for me anyway, Kerry Russell wearing a wig just looks like Kerry Russell wearing a wig. She stands out. You know, it's like the guy's a little bit more kind of the everyman character, but the real life moments are things like that. The screw top beer,
right.
You know, you're blown away when you're handed that. That's just as stressful, but it's something that comes across here in print. In TV, you'd probably just look ridiculous. But when you hear the inside of the person, you're saying, oh my gosh, I learned something from that. That's one thing your handlers did get right. They send you to Canada First, America
Right.
Junior, as they call it in The Simpsons.
Right. I give you another real-life moment real briefly. It happened to me once in Finland. I was to meet with a resident agent there to get my passport and some travel money to fly into Moscow, and we had these phrases to recognize each other. And the fellow didn't speak any English, and he butchered the phrase so much that it was beyond recognition. The only thing is that when you're supposed to meet somebody at a certain spot at 3:15, you actually don't need that phrase. You know right away who it is. It's like a blind date. You know, you look around and say, oh, that must be it.
Yeah.
Or she or her.
Yeah.
So anyway.
By the way, Jack Barsky had a cameo in The Americans, which you can see here. At jackbarsky.com, he said of the scene, finally, the public will get a glimpse of the real me. Suave, watchful, chain-smoking undercover dude. Disclaimer, the clothes I am wearing are not mine. They were supposedly what suave undercover dudes were wearing in the 80s. Yikes. As always, I highly recommend this show. They are very entertaining, and they do nail the psychological aspects of an undercover existence. And when you are finished with the fiction, try the real deal. Again, that's his book, Deep Undercover. I agree with Jack. The Americans recaptured the Reagan era perfectly. The only gripes I had were tiny things, like this in the home of our spies, the Jennings family. In the 1980s, we didn't need warning stickers telling us not to stand under garage doors. Ah yes, it was a simpler, braver time, and that's just how we rolled. I was surprised that nobody in the FX production thought to cover up those labels, or find a set with doors from the period. Granted, it's a blink and you miss it detail, but once I'd seen them, I found myself looking for the stickers in every scene that took place in the garage. And honestly, those old garage doors were really cool, and I think they would have added something to those scenes. The same goes for the Jennings house itself and the neighborhood. It all looks too modern, with updated touches like vinyl shutters. Compare this to the house used for another drama of the period, Amazon Prime's Red Oaks. There are plenty of homes out there that are fixed in time, and I do wish they'd sought one of those out for the Americans. But this is a cable production, so maybe they just lacked the resources to get every last leg warmer right. But the positives of this show far, far outweigh any negatives. For example, the use of 80s music, including the opening scene of the series, which employs Fleetwood Mac's Tusk to great effect. It does a fantastic job setting up the period, while the lyrics weave themselves into the various plot elements and add tension to the spy missions. By the way, although Jack Barsky showed up on The Americans, he wasn't the spy who inspired the fictional Jennings clan. Credit for that goes to Tim and Alex Vavilov and their parents, sleeper agents Andrei Bezrukov and Elena Vavilova. When writing historical fiction, there's no substitute for research and first-person accounts. Joseph Weisberg, creator of The Americans, worked at the Central Intelligence Agency's Directorate of Operations in the early 90s. Because of that, the CIA Publications Review Board had to okay all of his scripts, which gives you an idea of just how closely he hewed to the facts. Speaking of realism, it impresses me that actor Matthew Rhys, who plays the spy Philip Jennings, is an Englishman playing a Russian pretending to be an American. Very Victor Victoria. Keeping those accents and the cultural tells straight throughout this series earns him special praise in my book. I also have to mention the casting of Richard Thomas as FBI agent Frank Gadd. We can thank producer Joel Fields for that casting choice, and for many of these sideways choices in this series that keep us involved and make it seem all that more real. Richard Thomas told the Television Academy Foundation in one of their long-form interviews, which, if you're into TV, I cannot recommend enough. You can find them at METVlegends.org. that only a friend would have thought of him for this part, so far outside his typical roles. The Americans didn't want an actor who'd played G-Men 1,000 times. They wanted someone more counterintuitive, and indeed, Richard Thomas called this a part unlike I've ever played. I really loved him in this role, and I have to confess, I never watched The Waltons, I never liked The Waltons, and I always found Thomas's character of John Boy annoying. Plus, he starred in the hated 1980s Star Wars ripoff,
Battle Beyond the Stars.
But Richard Thomas as Agent Frank Gadd more than washed away all of those bad memories. He nailed this part, and I just loved seeing something on the screen that I hadn't seen a million times already. After all, do we really need to watch a character actor like Robert Loggia in his 800th uniform? When you choose somebody that you look at and say, hey, that's a cop, well, it takes the pressure off the writers. And here, they wanted the storytelling to do that lifting for them. There are so many bold, fresh choices like that in The Americans, and you can enjoy them and get an insight into the confusion, paranoia, and mistrust the Soviets had through the eyes of people that look real. For instance, Jack Barsky's experience was mirrored in that of Philip Jennings, who comes to see that the United States isn't this evil capitalist regime that he's been raised to hate. That brings me to my favorite scene of the series after John Hinckley shoots President Ronald Reagan, and Elizabeth Jennings is convinced, like those paranoid Soviets back home, that Secretary of State Alexander Haig is about to launch a military coup d'etat.
All these years walking these streets, living with these people, you still really don't understand this place. Haig could have 10 nuclear footballs. This still wouldn't be a coup.
Really?
Yes, really. And if we send that to Moscow, they will go on high alert. And our command control isn't quite state-of-the-art. I know how the Americans do things, and Al Haig isn't taking over the government.
You don't think they're all about lies and conspiracy like everybody else? Because they are. Why do you think that they're so different, that they're so pure?
I don't. But the last 2 times our leaders died, our government pretended they weren't dead for weeks. Things are different here.
Now, I remember vividly when Reagan was shot, and the apoplectic reaction in the media over the Secretary of State, who was a former general, Al Haig, declaring,
constitutionally, gentlemen, you have the president, the vice president, and the Secretary of State in that order. And should the president decide he wants to transfer the helm to the vice president, he will do so. As of now, I am in control here in the White House, pending return of the vice president, and in close touch with him.
Secretary Haig got the order of succession incorrect in the heat of that moment. The House Speaker, at the time Tip O'Neill, a Democrat of Massachusetts, and the Senate's President pro tempore, Strom Thurmond, a Republican of South Carolina, both held offices that came before the sex state in the line of succession. Remember that Reagan was the 5th sitting U.S. president to be shot, and the 4 previous victims, Abraham Lincoln in 1865, James A. Garfield in 1881, almost exactly 100 years before Reagan, William McKinley in 1901, and John F. Kennedy in 1963 had all died of their wounds. You could see why all this confusion would have freaked out Moscow, who, as Jack Barsky says, were defined by paranoid delusions, such as the one that the space shuttle would drop out of orbit and nuke Moscow. On the U.S. side, Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger was told the Soviets had doubled the number of submarines that lurked in an area off the U.S. East Coast called the Box. Although it turned out later to simply be new ships replacing the old at the end of their deployment, missteps like that could easily have led to World War III, which is a constant threat we lived with during the Cold War, and the kind captured again and again in this series. Moments like those are why I very much recommend The Americans, especially at this time of increased tensions with the former Soviet Union. Jack Barsky shared his take on how he'd deal with today's Russia. For my June 2021 Washington Times column, former KGB agent Jack Barsky says Biden blunders on Russia strategy. So if you're looking for insight into the Cold War, you can read that column, you can read Jack Barsky's book, Deep Undercover, and you can definitely and should binge watch The Americans. You won't be disappointed. That's it for this episode of History Author Showtime. If you enjoyed this breakdown, please do subscribe to the History Author Show's YouTube channel for more about what Hollywood gets right and wrong about yesterday, and for interviews out of our iHeartRadio archives. Well, it's time to get some fresh ice and trade this week's vodka for my beloved all-American Kentucky bourbon. Thanks for watching History Author Showtime. Now go read a book.